230 million years ago, it started raining. Not seasonally, not a monsoon, not a run of wet years that would eventually end and be forgotten. Rain that fell without meaningful interruption for 1 million years. 2 million years. Entire mountain ranges that no longer exist were dissolved and carried into the sea. Continents that had been deserts for 50 million years were covered in rivers and forests within a geological eye blink. Animals that had dominated the land for 30 million years disappeared, not from an asteroid strike, not from a volcanic winter, but simply because their world drowned. And in this new wet world, from the marginal cracks in the ecosystem, emerged creatures that had previously been barely noticed, small, upright, hungry, what we call dinosaurs. Everything began with rain. Today we go there. Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel. Your support makes this work possible, and there is much more to explore. Thank you. To understand what the rain meant, you first need to understand what the world looked like before it started. And the world before the rain was almost unimaginably dry. 235 million years ago, Earth had one continent, not a collection of continents separated by oceans, one land mass. Pangaea. The supercontinent stretched from pole to pole, covering roughly a third of the planet's surface in an unbroken mass of rock. Pangaea had been assembling itself for hundreds of millions of years before this. Various smaller landmasses colliding, suturing, merging into a single enormous entity. And the consequence of having one continent rather than many was a climate unlike anything the modern Earth experiences anywhere. Think about what continents do to climate. Oceans moderate temperature. They absorb heat in summer and release it in winter. They evaporate water into the atmosphere, fueling the rain that falls on land. The further you get from an ocean, the more extreme your climate becomes. Hotter in summer, colder in winter, and drier year-round because the moisture from the ocean never reaches you. The American Midwest gets far less rain than the Atlantic coast. For this reason, the Central Asian steppes are dramatically drier than European coastal regions. The interior of continents is always more extreme than their edges. Now scale this effect up to a continent the size of Pangaea. The interior of Pangaea, which in area would have covered most of modern North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America combined, was so far from any ocean that essentially no moisture reached it. Atmospheric moisture from the Tethys Sea, the shallow tropical ocean that cut into Pangaea's eastern margin like a wedge, could penetrate perhaps a few hundred miles inland before being exhausted. The rest of the continent, millions of square miles of it, received almost no precipitation at all. Not occasional drought, essentially permanent hyper-arid conditions, year after year, decade after decade, million year after million year. The geological evidence for this is extraordinary. In the rock record from the Middle Triassic, the period just before the rain, geologists find vast deposits of evaporites, salt, gypsum, and hydrite. These minerals form only when water evaporates, and they form in quantities like this only when water has been evaporating from the same location for a very long time. In some regions, the Triassic evaporite deposits are kilometers thick, kilometers of salt, representing the concentrated residue of countless years of evaporation in shallow lakes and coastal seas that received more water from the atmosphere than they contributed back. This is not the geology of an occasionally dry world. This is the geology of a planet in the grip of continental scale, multi-million-year aridity. Life in this world was not absent. Life is remarkably difficult to eliminate entirely, but it was compressed, constrained, pushed to the edges. The coastlines of Pangaea, where ocean moisture could still reach the land, supported ecosystems. The floodplains of rivers fed by those coastal rains supported ecosystems. But the vast interior of the supercontinent was essentially lifeless, or if not lifeless, then populated only by the most extreme specialists, organisms adapted to conditions that would kill anything from the modern world almost immediately. The animals that thrived in this pre-rain Triassic world were exquisitely adapted to heat and drought. The dominant large herbivores were rhynchosaurs, stocky, barrel-bodied reptiles that looked something like a cross between a pig and a small rhinoceros, with beaked mouths specialized for processing tough, drought-resistant vegetation. They were everywhere in the Middle Triassic fauna of Gondwana, the southern portion of Pangaea. Tens of millions of years of evolution had shaped them perfectly for a world of sparse, fibrous plants in hot, dry conditions. Alongside them lived the etosaurs, heavily armored relatives of the crocodile lineage, covered in bony plates like a living tank, feeding on roots and tubers in the dry soil. And the Metaposaurus relatives, giant flat-headed amphibians that sprawled in the muddy shallows of seasonal rivers, some reaching lengths of 10 feet or more, surviving the dry season by burrowing into the mud and waiting for rain that always eventually came but never came in overwhelming quantities. And above them in the predator tier, various archosaurs and early crocodilomorphs, fast-moving, efficient, perfectly calibrated to a world of seasonal feast and frequent famine. There were also, in this world, the early dinosaurs. But here is the crucial context. In the early and middle Triassic, dinosaurs were not dominant. They were not the rulers of their ecosystems. They were a minor lineage of small to medium-sized upright walking archosaurs, occupying modest ecological positions in the margins of ecosystems dominated by other groups. If you had walked through a middle Triassic landscape and tried to identify the animals that would inherit the Earth, you would not have pointed at the small bipedal dinosaurs trotting nervously at the edges of waterholes. You would have pointed at the rhynchosaurs, at the attosaurs, at the large Rauisuchians and other powerful predatory archosaurs that clearly ran the show. The dinosaurs of the Middle Triassic were, ecologically speaking, minor players in a drama they had not yet been given permission to lead. Then, approximately 230 million years ago, something happened in what is now northwestern Canada. Deep in the mantle, beneath the Wrangell terrain, a region that would eventually be transported by plate tectonics to become part of the Pacific coast of North America. A massive upwelling of hot mantle material reached the base of the lithosphere. This is what geologists call the Large Igneous Province, or LIP, a volcanic event of such enormous scale that it does not produce ordinary mountains or ordinary lava flows, but instead floods entire regions with molten rock from fissures that can stretch for hundreds of miles. The Pangaea LIP poured out vast quantities of basalt, probably over a period of hundreds of thousands of years, building up lava plateaus of extraordinary thickness across an area that may have covered hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean floor and coastal terrain. The direct physical destruction from this eruption, vast as it was not the mechanism that changed the world. What changed the world was what the Pangaea LIP injected into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide primarily, but also sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and enormous quantities of water vapor from the interaction of magma with the shallow ocean and coastal sediments it was erupting through. The carbon dioxide went into the atmosphere and stayed there, accumulating over hundreds of thousands of years of sustained eruption, driving a greenhouse warming effect that raised global temperatures significantly. And higher temperatures meant one specific and critical thing for the climate of Pangaea's hyper-arid interior. Higher temperatures meant more evaporation from the ocean surface. More evaporation meant more water vapor in the atmosphere. More water vapor meant more clouds. More clouds meant more rain. And once enough moisture was being cycled into the atmosphere, the extraordinary thermal machinery of Pangaea's interior, the same machinery that had been generating heat extremes and desert conditions for millions of years, began pumping that moisture deep into the continental interior as violent convective storms. The hot, dry interior of Pangaea, which had been baking for so long, became the engine of its own drenching. This is the Carnian Pluvial episode. Carnian refers to the geological stage, the specific subdivision of the Triassic period, and pluvial refers to rainfall. The Carnian Pluvial episode, the rainy phase of the Carnian age. It sounds bureaucratic. The reality it describes was anything but. The geological evidence for the transition is preserved in rocks across the world, and it is some of the most dramatic before and after evidence in the entire geological record. In the Dolomites of northern Italy, the sharp white peaks that rise above the alpine meadows of northeastern Italy, geologists in the 20th century found something remarkable. In the Triassic rock sequences exposed in the Dolomite formations, there is a layer. Below the layer, the rocks are typical Middle Triassic evaporites and carbonates, the geology of warm, shallow, evaporating seas in a hot, dry world. Above the layer, there is something completely different. Mudstones, coal seams, plant fossils, the geology of wet, forested, rain-saturated land. The transition between the two rock types, between the geology of the arid world and the geology of the drowned world, takes place over a thickness of rock that represents perhaps 100,000 years. In a geological column that spans hundreds of millions of years, 100,000 years is less than the width of a pencil line. The world that had been dry for tens of millions of years transformed into a world of forests and rivers in what amounts to an instant. Similar transitions have been found in Greenland, in China, in the American Southwest, in Germany, in Morocco. Every place where Triassic rocks are exposed in sufficient detail, geologists find the same signal, the same abrupt change from arid to humid, the same disappearance of evaporite minerals, the same appearance of coal and plant fossils. The Carnian Pluvial episode was not a local event. It was global. The entire planet changed at once, and the change was preserved simultaneously in rocks on every continent now. What does it actually mean when rain falls without interruption for 1,000,000 years? Not literally every day without a break. Weather still varied. Dry seasons still occurred. Individual years were drier than others. But the sustained average moisture input to the continental interior of Pangaea increased so dramatically and remained elevated for so long that the geological and ecological effects were equivalent to a continuous deluge. Rivers that had been seasonal or entirely absent became permanent. Lakes that had been ephemeral became deep, stable bodies of water. Soils that had been salt-crusted and barren began to develop the organic layer that only forms when plants grow and die in sufficient density over sufficient time. Try to hold this in your mind. A river appears in a desert. The desert plants, which evolved for minimal water, which store water in their tissues, which space themselves widely to capture what little moisture is available, cannot cope with a permanent river. They are not equipped for it. They have no adaptations for waterlogged soil, for the competition with faster-growing, water-hungry species that immediately appear when moisture becomes available. The desert community begins to die. It dies from too much of the thing it had always lacked. And in the space it leaves behind, new plants, ferns, horsetails, early conifers, an explosion of vegetation forms that had been confined to moist coastal refugia for millions of years. Pour in and fill the space. Now multiply this across a continent. Multiply it across millions of square miles. Multiply it across 1,000,000 years, 2,000,000 years of sustained elevated rainfall. The transformation of the Pangaean interior during the Carnian Pluvial episode was not gradual in any meaningful ecological sense. For the organisms living through it, it was catastrophic. The world they were built for ceased to exist, and a different world replaced it with a speed that evolution could not match. This is the mechanism by which the Carnian Pluvial episode killed. Not directly. Rain does not kill a rhynchosaur by falling on it. It kills by destroying the ecosystem that the rhynchosaur depended on. Rhynchosaurs ate specific plants in specific dry habitats. Those plants died when the habitat drowned. The rhynchosaurs starved. The attosaurs, armored and root-eating, lost their root-bearing soils to the encroaching wet vegetation. The Metoposaurus amphibians, which had been successful precisely because they could survive both dry and moderately wet conditions, found themselves outcompeted in the new permanently wet environment by organisms better suited to it. The ecosystem of the dry world came apart not because anything attacked it directly, but because the ground beneath it shifted. The losses were severe. By the end of the Carnian Pluvial episode, rhynchosaurs, which had been among the most abundant and widespread herbivores in Gondwana's Triassic fauna, were extinct. Atosaurs were dramatically reduced in diversity. Metoposaurus and its giant amphibian relatives largely disappeared from the fossil record. The large predatory Rauisuchians and their relatives declined sharply. The dominant fauna of the Middle Triassic, built over 30 million years of evolution in a hot, dry world, was comprehensively dismantled. The numbers, as best as the fossil record allows us to reconstruct them, are significant. Some analyses suggest that the Carnian Pluvial episode drove the extinction of something in the range of 30 to 33% of marine genera. The marine realm was affected too, as the changed chemistry of continental runoff, the altered ocean circulation, and the acidification effects of the volcanic carbon dioxide disrupted marine ecosystems alongside terrestrial ones. The marine losses during the Carnian are comparable in scale to some of the better-known mass extinctions of the geological record, though the Carnian event receives a fraction of the attention. But here is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Because the Carnian Pluvial episode was not only a destroyer. For certain organisms, the right organisms, the ones that happened to possess traits that the new wet world rewarded rather than punished, the Carnian Pluvial episode was the most extraordinary gift that the random processes of geology could have delivered. The dinosaurs were in the right place at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right biology. Early dinosaurs were already upright walking. Their legs were directly beneath their bodies rather than splaying out to the sides, as in most other reptiles. This posture was almost certainly an adaptation to the environments they had been occupying in the pre-pluvial world. Fast-moving, active animals in terrain where efficiency of movement mattered. It also, entirely accidentally, made them well suited to moving through the denser vegetation of the new wet world. They were generalists, capable of eating a wide variety of food sources, animal prey, insects, plant material, which meant that as the plant community was being completely reorganized, they could shift their diet in ways that specialists could not. And they were, in the early stages of the pluvial episode, already beginning to diversify. The ecological pressure was building even before the rain, even before the extinctions created open space. What the rain did was remove the ceiling. Imagine a job market in which all the senior positions are occupied by experienced incumbents who show no sign of leaving. The junior employees, talented, energetic, capable, are stuck in entry-level roles. They cannot advance because there is nowhere to advance to. Then, in a short period, the senior employees retire or depart, not because they were outperformed, but because the company itself reorganized around different priorities. The entry-level employees suddenly find a landscape of vacant positions. They advance not because they beat anyone, but because the positions are open. This is roughly what happened to dinosaurs during and after the Carnian Pluvial episode. The dominant fauna of the Middle Triassic was not outcompeted by dinosaurs. It was removed by climate. And in the ecological vacuum created by that removal, dinosaurs, which had been present and minor for millions of years, expanded rapidly into the available niches. The fossil record shows this clearly. Below the Carnian Pluvial transition, dinosaurs are rare, small, and ecologically marginal in most Triassic fauna assemblages. Above the transition, in the late Triassic rocks that follow the Pluvial episode, dinosaurs are diverse, abundant, and increasingly dominant. The transformation is not gradual. It tracks the climate event with the precision of a biological response to an environmental trigger. And it was not only dinosaurs. The Carnian Pluvial episode and its immediate aftermath saw the appearance of the first true turtles, animals with their characteristic shell anatomy, in the fossil record. The first pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that would fill the Mesozoic skies for 150 million years, appear in rocks from this period. The first true crocodilomorphs, the lineage that leads directly to modern crocodilians, appear at or shortly after the Pluvial episode. The first true mammals, or at least the first creatures that unambiguously belong to the mammalian lineage, appear in the late Triassic immediately following the Carnian. The first extensive forests of conifers and other gymnosperm trees, not scattered groves in moist refugia, but continuous forests covering large areas of what had been desert, appear during the Pluvial episode and transform the terrestrial habitat in ways that persist to the present. In a geological interval of perhaps 10 to 15 million years, centered on the Carnian Pluvial episode, the fundamental cast of characters of the Mesozoic era assembled itself. The dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the crocodilians, the turtles, the mammals, all of the major vertebrate lineages that would define the next 150 million years of life on land appeared in rapid succession, drawn out of obscurity or directly originated by the ecological opportunities the Pluvial episode created. The Mesozoic era, with all its characteristic organisms and ecosystems, was assembled under the influence of 2 million years of rain. The forests that the rain built are worth dwelling on. Before the Carnian Pluvial episode, forests as we understand them, continuous canopy cover over large areas, multiple layers of vegetation from ground cover to understory to canopy, deep organic soils, complex decomposer communities, essentially did not exist in the interior of Pangaea. There were trees. There were stands of conifers and seed ferns in moist areas. But the vast interior of the supercontinent was open, desert, or at best sparse scrubland. The Carnian Pluvial episode changed this fundamentally. As rainfall increased and soils developed, the tree cover that had been confined to coastal zones expanded dramatically inward. For perhaps the first time in the history of the continent, true forests covered large areas of Pangaea's interior. These forests were not modern forests. The trees were conifers and ginkgo relatives, seed ferns and horsetails, species from lineages long extinct. There were no flowering plants. Those would not appear for another 100 million years. There was no grass. The understory was ferns. The ground cover was mosses and early liverworts. The smell of these forests would have been extraordinary, resinous, sharp, green, utterly unlike any forest smell a modern human has experienced. But structurally, ecologically, functionally, they were forests. They provided shade and habitat complexity. They created food resources in their seeds, their leaves, their dead wood. They stabilized soils and regulated water flow. They changed the local climate by transpiring water back into the atmosphere, creating a positive feedback loop that sustained the wet conditions long after the initial volcanic forcing might otherwise have diminished. The forests also represented a completely new ecological niche. Nothing in the Middle Triassic had been adapted to life in closed canopy forest, because closed canopy forest had not existed in the places where Middle Triassic animals lived. The development of forests during the Carnian Pluvial episode created a three-dimensional habitat: ground, understory, canopy, that had been essentially absent from the continental interior. And organisms that could exploit vertical space, that could climb, that could fly, that could live in trees, these organisms suddenly had an enormous advantage. The pterosaurs that appear in the rock record immediately following the Carnian Pluvial episode may have been, in part, forest animals first, gliding or flying from tree to tree, exploiting a habitat that had only recently become available on a large scale. Their origin is still debated, but the timing of their appearance with respect to the pluvial episode and the forest expansion is striking. The chemistry of the oceans changed dramatically during the Carnian Pluvial episode, and the marine losses deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts of this event. When rainfall increases dramatically over a continent, the runoff that returns to the ocean changes in character. It carries more organic material, dissolved carbon from newly active soils, nutrients from freshly weathered rock, minerals from the rapid erosion of landscapes that are suddenly being doused with water after millions of years of relative dryness. This input changes ocean chemistry. It can drive productivity blooms in coastal zones, explosions of phytoplankton growth, while simultaneously creating zones of oxygen depletion as the organic material sinks and is decomposed. It changes the salinity and alkalinity of coastal waters in ways that affect reef organisms and shell-forming invertebrates. The Carnian Pluvial episode disrupted marine ecosystems that had developed over millions of years in the relatively stable conditions of the Middle Triassic. Reef communities that had built up through patient coral and sponge growth were damaged by altered water chemistry and the input of sediment from newly active rivers. Certain groups of ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that serve as index fossils for Triassic stratigraphy, experienced significant diversity changes across the Carnian boundary. The marine record of the Carnian Pluvial episode is less dramatic in its biological consequences than the terrestrial record, partly because marine ecosystems have more buffering capacity than terrestrial ones, but it is real and measurable in the fossil record. from Tethyan sections across what is now southern Europe and the Middle East. The duration of the Carnian Pluvial episode is itself one of the most extraordinary facts about it. 1 to 2 million years. Modern climate events, even the most dramatic natural climate shifts of the Quaternary, the glacial cycles that shaped human evolution, operate on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. The Carnian Pluvial episode sustained its altered conditions for longer than most ice ages last from start to finish. For the organisms living through it, it was not an event. It was simply the world. No creature alive during the Carnian Pluvial episode had any memory of the dry world before it. No creature alive when it ended had any memory of the wet world during it. The ecological transformation it produced was so thorough and so sustained that by the time conditions began to moderate, there was essentially no community of organisms waiting to reclaim the old world. The old world's organisms were gone, and the new world's organisms, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, the early turtle lineage, the early mammal lineage, had had millions of years to establish themselves, diversify, and become entrenched. This is fundamentally different from a fast catastrophe. When an asteroid strikes, as one struck 66 million years ago to end the Cretaceous, the destruction is immediate, and the survivors are determined by who happened to be in the right place at the right moment, with the right biology to survive a sudden global winter. Recovery begins within thousands to tens of thousands of years. The world before the impact and the world after are connected by a thread of surviving lineages that persist through the catastrophe. The Carnian Pluvial episode operated differently. Its timescale was long enough that it did not merely select survivors from a pre-existing community. It replaced the community. Generation after generation of rhynchosaurs attempted to survive in a world where their food plants were dying. Generation after generation failed. By the time the Pluvial episode was fully underway, there were no rhynchosaurs left to remember the dry world. There were only dinosaurs expanding into the wet world, diversifying, speciating, filling roles that rhynchosaurs had vacated so thoroughly that the ecological positions themselves had to be redefined by the new occupants. The rains stopped eventually. Volcanic activity at the Rangelia Lipi decreased. Carbon dioxide inputs moderated. The extreme greenhouse warming eased. Pangaea remained, and the continental interior remained drier than the coasts. And the Triassic did not transform overnight into the lush world we imagine when we picture the Jurassic. The late Triassic that followed the Carnian Pluvial episode was not a paradise of eternal forest. It was drier than the Pluvial maximum, more variable, with dry seasons and regional arid zones. But it was fundamentally different from the pre-Pluvial world in one crucial respect. It was a world of forests rather than deserts, of rivers rather than salt flats, of ecological complexity rather than extreme arid simplicity. And it was increasingly a world of dinosaurs. The dinosaur radiation that followed the Carnian Pluvial episode is one of the most dramatic in the fossil record. Within 10 to 15 million years of the pluvial maximum, dinosaurs had diversified into the major lineages that would characterize the Mesozoic, the sauropodomorphs, which would eventually produce the largest land animals in Earth's history, the theropods, which would eventually produce Tyrannosaurus rex, and much later, birds, the ornithischians, which would eventually produce the horned ceratopsians and the armored ankylosaurs. The body size range expanded dramatically from small, fast insectivores and omnivores to the first large herbivores capable of processing the new forest vegetation in bulk. The ecological roles they occupied multiplied. Apex predators, large herbivores, small ground-dwelling foragers, possibly the first dinosaurian arborealists in the new forest environments. This radiation was not a gradual, stately process of evolutionary refinement. It had the character of an ecological explosion, which is exactly what it was. A release of evolutionary potential that had been constrained by ecological incumbency, suddenly freed by the removal of that incumbency through climate change. The Carnian Pluvial episode was not the cause of dinosaur diversity in any simple or direct sense, but it created the conditions in which that diversity could express itself by removing the ecological lid that had kept dinosaurs marginal for their first 30 million years of existence. Here is the measure of what the rain built. When the asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago and ended the Cretaceous period, the dominant land animals of Earth were dinosaurs. They had been the dominant land animals for approximately 150 million years. 150 million years of ecological supremacy, of evolutionary refinement, of diversification into every conceivable terrestrial niche. Sauropods eating forest canopy, hadrosaurs grazing floodplains, ceratopsians processing tough vegetation in upland environments, theropods filling every predator niche from the very small to the very large. This 150 million years of dinosaur world was not inevitable. It was not the predetermined outcome of some biological superiority. It was the consequence of an event that almost no one has heard of. 2 million years of rain, 230 million years ago, that cleared the ecological stage and handed the script to the wrong, or perhaps the right, set of actors. Every bird that flies over your head is a dinosaur. Not metaphorically, literally. Birds are theropod dinosaurs, living descendants of the lineage that began its rise during and immediately after the Carnian Pluvial episode. The pigeon sitting on your windowsill is the evolutionary consequence of rain that fell on what is now the Canadian coast 230 million years ago, triggering a chain of events: warming, flooding, extinction, ecological vacuum, explosive diversification, that eventually produced every species of bird alive today. Approximately 10,000 species of birds currently inhabit this planet. They are all rain. The Carnian Pluvial episode receives only a fraction of the scientific and popular attention that the Permian extinction, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, or even the lesser-known late Triassic extinction that followed it by 30 million years receive. This is partly because its evidence is more subtle. No single catastrophic boundary, no global layer of iridium or shocked quartz, no obvious bolide impact. It is a climate event, and climate events announce themselves quietly in the gradual shift of rock types across a stratigraphic section, in the changing ratio of carbon isotopes in ancient marine sediments, in the replacement of one fossil fauna by another across a section of rock that might be 100 feet thick and represent 2 million years of time. It takes trained eyes and careful analysis to read this story from the rock record. It lacks the dramatic clarity of an asteroid impact, but its consequences were as world-altering as any impact, perhaps more so, because the Carnian Pluvial episode did not merely reset the biological slate, it actively built the Mesozoic world. It created the forests. It created the conditions in which the new fauna could diversify. It sustained the changed conditions long enough that there was no going back. When the rain finally ended, the world it left behind was so thoroughly transformed that even the memory of the pre-pluvial world was gone from the living community. There was no one left to reclaim it. We live in the world that the rain made. The forests we walk through are the descendants of the forests the rain built. The birds we hear in the morning are the descendants of the dinosaurs the rain promoted. The mammals we are, warm-blooded, complex, ecologically dominant since the demise of the non-avian dinosaurs, are the descendants of the early mammalian lineage that appeared during the Carnian Pluvial episode, spent 150 million years in ecological subordination to the dinosaurs that the rain also created, and then inherited the Earth when those dinosaurs were ended by an altogether different kind of catastrophe. The rain that fell 230 million years ago on a supercontinent that no longer exists shaped the world you woke up in this morning. The coffee you drink, if it comes from a plant in a tropical forest, grows in an ecosystem whose fundamental structure descends from the forests the rain built. The birds outside your window trace their lineage to creatures that first expanded into the new wet world of the Carnian. The planet itself, its ecology, its biodiversity, the broad pattern of which organisms are present and which are not, carries the imprint of 2 million years of rain in a world we can no longer see. But let us go deeper into what those 2 million years actually looked like on the ground, because the abstract geology of evaporite to coal transitions, while scientifically compelling, does not capture the visceral reality of what the land was experiencing. Let us go to a specific place. The Dolomites of northern Italy 230 million years ago. In the Middle Triassic, this region was a shallow tropical sea. The Tethys Ocean extended far to the west of where it would eventually contract. And the area that is now the dramatic white peaks of the Dolomite Mountains was a warm, carbonate-producing, reef-fringed platform at the edge of Pangaea. Corals and sponges built reefs. Ammonites coiled through the clear water. The shoreline was a narrow band of beach and coastal scrub, beyond which the Pangaean interior extended in dry, hot desolation for thousands of miles. The Tethys was like a narrow dagger of ocean penetrating the continent, bringing moisture to its immediate margins, but unable to reach the vast interior. Then the rain started, slowly at first, a pattern shift in the storms, a tendency toward heavier precipitation events, a slight rise in annual rainfall that might not have been noticed by any organism capable of noticing. But the chemical record in the rocks is unambiguous about the timing and the pace. Within a geologically short period, probably 100,000 years, possibly less, the rock record shifts from the chemistry of evaporation to the chemistry of precipitation. Carbonates give way to siliciclastics. Evaporite minerals disappear. The first coal seams appear, thin at first, then thicker, representing the accumulation of plant material in waterlogged soils. Within 200,000 years of the transition beginning, the Dolomite platform was receiving rainfall at rates that would be recognized today as tropical. Perhaps 1.5 to 2 meters of rain annually, falling year-round rather than seasonally. The same transition is visible in the Mercia mudstone of England, where the brick-red, dry climate sediments of the Middle Triassic give way to the grey and green muds of wetter conditions. It is visible in the Chinle Formation of the American Southwest, the vivid colored bands of Arizona's Painted Desert, where the brilliant reds and purples of oxidized arid climate sediments give way to the greens and grays of reduced, water-saturated sediments at exactly the Carnian boundary. The Chinle Formation is the rock unit that preserves the petrified forest of Arizona, those spectacular silicified logs lying in an otherwise barren landscape. And the trees that became the petrified forest grew during and after the Carnian Pluvial episode. Their size, their density, their preservation in what is now desert is a direct record of the forests the rain built. The Chinle Formation tells the story particularly vividly because it has been so thoroughly studied, and because the American Southwest preserves a nearly continuous section of late Triassic rock. Below the Carnian boundary, the rocks record classic arid conditions. Aeolian sandstones from ancient sand dunes, evaporite minerals, paleosols with the cracked and curled structure of dried mud. Above the boundary, the rocks record river systems, floodplains, lakes, and forests. The rivers that produced these sediments were not the ephemeral drainages of a seasonal desert, but permanent systems with sustained flow, comparable to what you might find today in a warm, temperate or subtropical region with year-round rainfall. The transition is not gradual. It is, in geological terms, a step change. The flora preserved in the Chinle Formation and its equivalents around the world provides some of the most direct evidence for what the Carnian Pluvial episode actually created on the land surface. The dominant trees of these new Carnian forests were conifers, relatives of modern pines and araucarias, though belonging to extinct families. They grew tall, their trunks reaching diameters of several feet, their canopies reaching heights that had not been seen in the continental interior of Pangaea before the pluvial episode. Alongside them grew tree ferns and horsetail trees, the latter reaching heights comparable to small modern trees, filling the understory role in the new forest ecosystem. The ground beneath was covered in ferns and mosses, a dense, verdant, layered community that would have been recognizable in its basic structure to any modern observer of tropical or subtropical forests, even though none of the specific plant species would be familiar. The richness of this plant community, assembled rapidly from the various drought-resistant lineages that had survived in moist refugia during the Middle Triassic arid phase, produced the food resources that drove the animal diversification of the late Triassic. Conifer seeds are energy-dense and nutritious. Fern fronds are palatable to a wide range of herbivores. The sheer productivity of forest ecosystems, which produce far more biomass per unit area than desert or scrubland ecosystems, supported a much larger herbivore population than the pre-pluvial world had been capable of sustaining. And larger herbivore populations supported larger, more diverse predator communities. The sauropodomorph dinosaurs, the lineage that would eventually produce the largest land animals in Earth's history, make their most significant early appearances in the late Triassic, shortly after the Carnian Pluvial episode. The earliest sauropodomorphs were relatively modest animals, perhaps 10 to 15 feet long, walking partially on 2 legs and partially on 4, eating the new forest vegetation with long necks that gave them access to food at heights unavailable to most of their competitors. But the trajectory was clear. These were animals that would scale upward, that would exploit the high-energy forest ecosystem to grow to sizes that the pre-pluvial world, with its sparse vegetation and limited primary productivity, could never have supported. The giant sauropods of the Jurassic, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, the titanosaurs, were children of the Carnian forests. Their lineage was born in the rain. The theropod dinosaurs, which would eventually produce the most famous predators in the fossil record, also underwent significant diversification during the late Triassic. The earliest theropods were small, fast, bipedal predators, agile hunters of insects, small vertebrates, and whatever else their ecological position made available. During and after the Carnian Pluvial episode, they diversified rapidly, with larger-bodied forms appearing that could tackle the growing herbivore fauna. The predator-prey dynamics that would characterize the entire Mesozoic era were being established during this period, shaped by the forest environments and the diverse herbivore community that the pluvial episode had created. There is a specific and striking piece of evidence about the relationship between the Carnian Pluvial episode and dinosaur origins that comes from the isotopic chemistry of ancient soils. Paleosols, ancient soils preserved in the rock record, record the chemistry of the atmosphere and rainfall at the time of their formation through the isotopic composition of their carbonate minerals. By analyzing the carbon and oxygen isotope ratios in Triassic paleosols from multiple continents, researchers have been able to reconstruct the history of moisture availability through the Triassic in a way that does not depend on identifying specific rock types or fossil fauna. And the isotopic record tells the same story as the rock types and the fossils. A step change in moisture conditions at the Carnian, sustained over the duration of the pluvial episode, and then a partial relaxation back toward drier conditions in the late Triassic. This isotopic record also allows researchers to compare the timing of the climate change with the timing of the biological change, and the correlation is striking. The diversification of dinosaurs in the fossil record tracks the isotopic moisture signal through the Carnian with a precision that is difficult to explain by coincidence. As moisture increases, dinosaur diversity increases. As the ecosystem fills with forests and rivers and new ecological niches, the fossil record fills with new dinosaur species occupying those niches. The rain and the dinosaurs are not merely temporally associated. They are causally connected through the ecology of the new world the rain created. Let us also give proper attention to the pterosaurs, because their appearance in the fossil record at exactly this time is one of the most remarkable developments of the Carnian, and because they are frequently overlooked in accounts of Triassic evolution that focus on the dinosaurian radiation. The pterosaurs are the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. They did not glide, they actively flapped, using a wing membrane supported by an enormously elongated fourth finger. And they ranged in size from small sparrow-like forms to, eventually in the Mesozoic, the largest flying animals in the history of life. Their origins are poorly understood. The earliest pterosaurs appear in the fossil record already fully flight-capable, with no clear transitional forms showing intermediate stages. But they appear in rocks from the late Triassic that post-date the Carnian Pluvial episode. The connection between pterosaur origins and the Carnian forests is speculative but compelling. Forest environments create selection pressure for vertical mobility. The ability to move through a three-dimensional habitat, to reach food at height, to escape predators by moving to inaccessible locations, to patrol large areas of forested terrain efficiently, provides advantages that are simply absent in open, low-vegetation environments. The forest world created by the Carnian Pluvial episode was the first time, at least in the continental interior of Pangaea, that these selection pressures existed at scale. The pterosaurs that appear in the fossil record after the Pluvial episode may have been responding to exactly this, the new ecological opportunities of the three-dimensional forest environment that the rain had built. The turtles deserve a moment too. The earliest unambiguous turtles, animals with the characteristic fully formed shell of modern turtles, including both the carapace above and the plastron below, appear in rocks from the late Triassic of Germany, China, and other locations. Their origin has long been one of the most puzzling questions in vertebrate paleontology. The turtle body plan is so distinctive, so different from any other vertebrate body plan, that tracing its evolutionary origins proved enormously difficult. Recent fossil discoveries in China have pushed back the record of turtle-like features into the Middle Triassic, suggesting that the lineage has deep roots. But the first animals that are unambiguously turtles appear after the Carnian Pluvial episode, and their spread across the world in the late Triassic tracks. The availability of the permanent water bodies, rivers, lakes, swamps, that the Pluvial episode created. Turtles need water. The Pluvial episode made water abundant in places where it had been absent. Turtles spread. The mammals, or rather, the immediate precursors of what would become the first true mammals, are perhaps the most personally relevant group to emerge from the shadow of the Carnian Pluvial episode. The mammalian lineage, the synapsids, had deep roots in the Paleozoic and had been the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates before the Permian extinction 252 million years ago had devastated them. The Triassic, for the synapsid lineage, was a long recovery from the devastating losses of the Permian extinction through a period of ecological subordination to the rising archosaurs, to the gradual development of more and more mammal-like features in the cynodont lineage. By the time of the Carnian Pluvial episode, the cynodonts had diversified considerably, and some lineages were crossing the threshold into what we would recognize as true mammals. With fully differentiated teeth, sophisticated jaw mechanics, likely warm blood, and the capacity for extended parental care that would become the defining characteristic of the mammalian reproductive strategy. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not create mammals, but it created the conditions in which the earliest mammals, small, nocturnal insectivorous, hiding in the undergrowth of the new forests from the increasingly large and dangerous dinosaurs, could establish themselves and persist. The forests of the Carnian provided cover. The insect communities that flourished in the wet New World provided food. The ecological marginality that the rain enforced on the early mammals pushed into the night hours, confined to the small body size range by predation pressure from growing dinosaurs, may have been the crucible in which the distinctive mammalian toolkit of warm blood and extended parental care was forged. Being small and nocturnal in a warm-blooded world requires metabolic efficiency. The mammals that survived the Mesozoic in the shadow of the dinosaurs were being trained by ecological pressure for the cognitive and physiological complexity that would eventually allow them to inherit the Earth after the dinosaurs were gone. The Pangaea Liip, the volcanic event that triggered all of this, was operating in what is now the northeastern Pacific region of the planet, thousands of miles from where most of the biological action was playing out on Pangaea's land surface. The disconnect between cause and effect is striking. A fissure opens in the ocean floor off the coast of what is now British Columbia. Lava pours out. Carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere. The atmosphere warms. The ocean evaporates more readily. Moisture reaches the interior of a continent thousands of miles away. The salt flats of what will become Arizona and the Dolomites and China are doused with rain. Plants grow. Rhynchosaurs starve. Dinosaurs expand. The world changes. The causal chain is long, indirect, and counterintuitive. A volcanic event under the ocean is responsible for the diversification of the animals that will dominate the land for the next 150 million years. This is how Earth operates. Its systems are connected in ways that make direct causation difficult to trace and easy to overlook. The Carnian Pluvial episode lasted approximately from 233 to 232 million years ago at its core, with effects extending before and after. The 2 million year figure represents the sustained period of dramatically elevated rainfall, the heart of the pluvial episode. though the full period of climatic perturbation was somewhat longer, as conditions ramped up and then gradually moderated. During those 2 million years, the world was transformed more thoroughly than at any time since the Permian extinction 30 million years earlier. Not through a single catastrophic event, but through sustained, relentless, patient change. Rain on Monday, rain on Tuesday, rain for a year, rain for 10,000 years, rain for 1,000,000 years. The planet, soaked through, rebuilt itself around the new chemistry of abundance. The rain ended. The Pangaea volcanism declined. The atmospheric carbon dioxide stopped increasing and slowly began to moderate. The greenhouse warmth that had been driving the extraordinary moisture cycle began very slowly to diminish. The late Triassic that followed the pluvial maximum was drier than the maximum, but remained wetter and ecologically richer than the pre-pluvial world. The forests persisted. The rivers persisted. The dinosaurs, now diversified and ecologically entrenched, had nowhere to retreat to, even if the world had been trying to return to its pre-pluvial state, which it was not. The ecological transformation was complete, and complete transformations, in biology as in history, do not reverse. The late Triassic ended with its own extinction event, approximately 201 million years ago. The end Triassic extinction, triggered by the Camp Volcanic Province, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, as Pangaea began to rift apart along what would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. This extinction reduced dinosaur diversity significantly and eliminated many of the lineages that had survived the Carnian Pluvial episode. But the dinosaur survivors of the end Triassic extinction had 215 million years of accumulated evolutionary refinement behind them, tracing back through the late Triassic radiation to the Carnian expansion, to the initial appearance of the lineage in the Middle Triassic. They were robust, adaptable, and ecologically embedded in the world that the Carnian rain had built. They survived the end Triassic extinction. They expanded again into the Jurassic. They built the world we imagine when we think of the age of dinosaurs. Brachiosaurus in the savannas of what is now Tanzania. Allosaurus hunting in the forests of what is now Utah. Archaeopteryx gliding from tree to tree in what is now Bavaria. All of this was downstream of 2 million years of rain. Stand outside tonight if you can. Find a tree, any tree, anywhere on Earth's surface. Look at it. That tree is the descendant of the forests the rain built. Look at the birds in it, if there are birds. Those birds are the descendants of the dinosaurs that the rain promoted from marginal obscurity to global dominance. If you live in a part of the world where it rains, and most people do, the rain you experience is falling on landscapes whose basic ecological character was determined by events 230 million years ago. The rain cycle, the forest cover, the rivers, the biodiversity, all of it traces back through a chain of consequences and contingencies to the moment when the rock beneath British Columbia began to melt and the gases rose and the atmosphere changed, and the clouds formed over what is now the Dolomites, and it began to rain. 230 million years of distance separate us from the Carnian Pluvial episode. That distance is so vast that the human imagination cannot genuinely traverse it. The supercontinent it occurred on no longer exists. The species it killed are gone so completely that we know them only from fragments of bone and leaf impressions in ancient rock. The volcanic event that triggered it has been subducted into the mantle and recycled into the planet's interior, its physical record largely erased. But its biological record is everywhere. It is in every dinosaur that was ever alive, and in every bird that is alive today. It is in the forests that cover the land. It is in the turtles pulling themselves up riverbanks and the crocodilians lurking in tropical rivers. It is in you, in the mammalian body plan, the warm blood, the complex teeth, the extended parental care, the cognitive elaboration that these traits eventually produced, all of which trace their origins to the cynodont lineage that survived the Carnian Pluvial episode in the margins of the new wet world, hiding from dinosaurs in the undergrowth of the forests the rain built, waiting for 150 million years for the opportunity that would eventually come. The rain fell for 2 million years, and everything, every living thing on the surface of this planet, tracing its lineage back through time, is, in some sense, the child of that rain. There is a question that the Carnian Pluvial episode forces us to ask about our own moment in geological time. We are, right now, adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at rates that exceed the Pangaea-like volcanic output during the Carnian. The Pangaea eruptions, sustained over hundreds of thousands of years, injected carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate that modern estimates place at somewhere between 1/10 and 1/100th of the current anthropogenic emission rate. The Pangaea eruptions transformed the climate of Pangaea and triggered 2 million years of rain. We are doing what Pangaea did, faster. This is not a comfortable observation. The Carnian Pluvial episode should not be read as a simple analogy for modern climate change. The world of the Triassic was different from the modern world in too many fundamental ways for simple parallels to hold. Pangaea no longer exists. The baseline climate of the modern Earth is different from the baseline of the Triassic. The organisms living today are different from the organisms living then, but the mechanism is identical. Carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. More moisture means more precipitation, shifted in its geographic distribution, potentially delivering rainfall to regions that previously received little. The hydrological cycle accelerates. The chemistry of the ocean changes. The ecosystems that are adapted to current conditions face challenges from those changing conditions. The Carnian Pluvial episode does tell us one thing about the consequences of rapid carbon dioxide increase that is worth holding in mind. The consequences were not primarily direct. The Carnian did not kill rhynchosaurs with rain. It killed them by transforming the ecosystem they depended on. The mechanism of biological disruption was ecosystem transformation, operating at a pace that evolution could not match. The pace mattered. A slow transformation allows evolutionary adaptation. A fast transformation, fast by geological standards, which still means hundreds of thousands of years, eliminates species by rendering their ecological requirements unavailable before adaptation can compensate. The Carnian Pluvial episode was fast by geological standards. It was invisible by human standards. The organisms that lived through it experienced not a catastrophe, but a world that slowly, generation by generation, became less hospitable until it became incompatible. No rhynchosaur watched the forests replace its feeding grounds. Its grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, 100 generations removed, faced a slightly different world. 1,000 generations removed, a significantly different world. 10,000 generations removed, an unrecognizable one. The extinction played out in slow motion, imperceptible to any individual within it, inexorable from the perspective of the geological record. This is the kind of extinction that leaves no single dramatic moment to point to. No layer of shocked quartz or iridium. No sudden transition in the fossil record from abundant to absent. Instead, a gradual thinning, species becoming rarer in successive geological sections, their range shrinking, their body sizes changing as resources become scarcer, their diversity declining as specialized forms fail and generalists persist for a while longer before they too run out of options. The Carnian extinction is this kind of extinction. Quiet, sustained, thorough. Let us return to the specific animals that defined the pre-pluvial world, because they deserve more than a passing mention as victims. The rhynchosaurs in particular were remarkable animals, not the lumbering, primitive creatures that a superficial reading of their extinction might suggest, but highly successful, ecologically important, genuinely sophisticated herbivores. They had complex jaw mechanics. Their beaks were not simple cutting tools, but elaborate processing apparatus, with multiple rows of teeth on the palate that meshed with teeth on the lower jaw to grind tough vegetation. This dental complexity rivaled that of many later dinosaurian herbivores. They were abundant. In some Middle Triassic faunas of South America and Africa, rhynchosaur bones represent the majority of the large vertebrate fossil material. They had persisted and diversified through 30 million years of Triassic evolution, outlasting many other lineages that had appeared alongside them. By any reasonable assessment, they were successful, and they were completely unable to respond to the Carnian Pluvial episode, because their success was entirely predicated on conditions that the pluvial episode eliminated. Their dental complex was adapted to specific plant types that grew in specific conditions. Their physiology was calibrated to the heat and aridity of the Middle Triassic interior. Their population dynamics were tuned to the seasonal rainfall and periodic drought that characterized the pre-pluvial climate. When the rainfall became permanent and the vegetation transformed, the rhynchosaur toolkit was not merely suboptimal, it was actively maladaptive. An organism perfectly calibrated to one set of conditions is, almost by definition, poorly calibrated to dramatically different conditions. Specialization is an ecological gamble, and the Carnian Pluvial episode called the Rhynchosaurs bet. The aetosaurs, those heavily armored, pig-like herbivores, also merit a moment. They were the dominant large herbivores in the northern portion of Pangaea, Laurasia, in the same way rhynchosaurs dominated the southern portion. Their armor, rows of bony scutes covering the back, flanks, and belly, made them formidable against the predators of their time. Their snout morphology, with its turned-up tip designed for rooting in dry soil for tubers and roots, is a precise adaptation to a specific feeding strategy in a specific environment. That environment was the cracked, dry season soils of a seasonally arid world. When those soils became permanently waterlogged, when the vegetation they were rooting through was replaced by forest plants growing in wet ground, the aetosaur feeding apparatus was working against rather than for its owners. The Metoposaurus, the giant flat-headed amphibian, a creature that looked something like a living manhole cover with a crocodile attached, is perhaps the most poignant of the Carnian casualties. It was enormously successful in the Middle Triassic, dominating the aquatic and semi-aquatic niches of Pangaean rivers and lakes. Giant amphibians had been present in the terrestrial ecosystem since the Carboniferous, 300 million years ago, and had survived every extinction event up to and including the Permian catastrophe. They were the veterans of the Triassic fauna, carrying within their lineage the evolutionary wisdom of hundreds of millions of years of aquatic predation, and they were eliminated by the Carnian Pluvial episode. The mechanism in the Metoposaurus case is subtle and tells us something important about how climatic transformation works. Metoposaurus was not killed by too much water. It was an aquatic animal, after all. It was killed by the wrong kind of water. The rivers and lakes that the pluvial episode created were different in character from the seasonal water bodies that Metoposaurus had evolved to exploit. They were permanent, deeper, faster flowing in some cases. They supported different fish communities, different plant communities along their banks, different invertebrate faunas in their depths. The ecological niche that Metoposaurus occupied, the ambush predator of seasonal African-style waterholes, lying motionless in the shallows waiting for prey to come to drink, was not available in the new river systems in the same form. And the true crocodilomorphs and early phytosaurs that were expanding during the pluvial episode were better suited to the new aquatic environments than the ancient Metoposaurus lineage. This is a recurring theme in the Carnian extinctions. The victims were not killed directly by the climate change. They were killed by the ecological reorganization that the climate change drove. The habitat changed. The food web changed. The competitors changed. And organisms that had been successful in the old configuration found themselves without the ecological context that their bodies and behaviors required. They were not defeated. Their predators did not overpower them. Their competitors did not outfight them. The world simply reorganized itself around different priorities, and they were on the wrong side of the reorganization. The fossils themselves tell this story if you know how to read them. In Triassic rock sequences from the Dolomites, from Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, from the Ecological Formation of Argentina, wherever the Carnian boundary is preserved in detail, paleontologists have traced the changes in fauna assemblage through the critical interval. Below the boundary, the typical Middle Triassic community, rhynchosaurs, etosaurs, Metoposaurus relatives, early archosaurs, rare and small dinosaurs. Above the boundary, a fundamentally different community. No rhynchosaurs, rare or absent etosaurs. No Metoposaurus, and dinosaurs that are suddenly diverse, abundant, and large enough to be ecologically important. The transition in the fossil record matches the transition in the rock chemistry. The same layers that show the change from evaporite to coal also show the change from the old fauna to the new. Ghost Ranch in New Mexico is worth visiting in the imagination for a moment, because it has produced some of the most spectacular evidence for the Carnian transition in North America. The site preserves extensive late Triassic bone beds, dense accumulations of dinosaur fossils that represent some of the earliest large-scale dinosaur communities in the world. The dominant dinosaur at Ghost Ranch was Coelophysis, a small, lightly built theropod about 9 feet long, apparently social, possibly capable of pack behavior, certainly adapted to the kind of active pursuit predation that the new forest and floodplain environments of the late Triassic rewarded. Coelophysis is not a Middle Triassic animal. It appears in the fossil record only after the Carnian Pluvial episode. It is a product of the new world the rain created. The Ecological Formation of Argentina, the Valley of the Moon, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, preserves one of the most complete records of the earliest dinosaur communities in the world. The famous Ecological dinosaurs, including Eoraptor and Arasaurus, represent the very beginning of the dinosaurian radiation in the late Triassic of South America. They are small, fast, ecologically marginal animals living in a world still recovering from the Carnian Pluvial episode, surrounded by other archosaurs that are in the process of declining. The Ecological fauna is a snapshot of the transition, a world in which dinosaurs have arrived but have not yet taken over, in which the old order is retreating and the new order is advancing, but the outcome is not yet certain. Within a few million years, the dinosaurs will be dominant. But in the Ecological, we can see them on the verge. There is one more aspect of the Carnian Pluvial episode's legacy that deserves careful attention, and it is the most abstract, but perhaps the most profound. The rain did not merely change which species existed. It changed the fundamental structure of terrestrial ecosystems in ways that have persisted to the present. Specifically, it established the closed canopy forest as the dominant terrestrial ecosystem type in the equatorial and temperate zones of the planet. A dominance that, with variations and interruptions, has characterized the terrestrial world from the late Triassic to today. Before the Carnian Pluvial episode, the default terrestrial ecosystem in the Pangaean interior was open and arid. Plants were sparse and drought-resistant, Herbivores were specialized for processing tough, low-nutrient vegetation. Predators were adapted to pursuit hunting in open terrain. The ecological logic of the system was the logic of scarcity. How to extract enough energy from a resource-poor environment. After the Carnian Pluvial episode, the default terrestrial ecosystem in the equatorial and temperate zones was forested and productive. Plants were dense and competed for light rather than water. Herbivores were specialized for processing large quantities of high-nutrient forest vegetation. Predators were adapted to ambush hunting in complex terrain. The ecological logic of the system was the logic of complexity. How to partition abundant resources among many competing species in a three-dimensional habitat. This shift in the fundamental logic of terrestrial ecosystems, from scarcity to complexity, is the deepest legacy of the Carnian Pluvial episode. Every terrestrial ecosystem that has existed since the late Triassic has been built on the forest template that the Carnian rain established. The Jurassic fern prairies and conifer forests, the Cretaceous angiosperm woodlands with their dinosaurian megafauna, the Cenozoic grasslands that spread from the ancestral forests during periods of cooling and drying, the tropical rainforests of today, the temperate deciduous forests, the boreal conifer forests. All of these are elaborations of the basic forest ecosystem structure that the Carnian Pluvial episode made possible by delivering sustained rainfall to the continental interior of Pangaea for 2 million years. We are, in the most literal ecological sense, forest animals. Our primate ancestors lived in trees. Our most immediate hominid ancestors emerged from forests into the savanna margins in Africa. Our earliest civilizations arose in the fertile floodplains of rivers fed by forested catchments. The cities we inhabit are built on landscapes that were forested before we cleared them. Our lungs are calibrated to air that has passed through forests. Our psychology retains what researchers call biophilia, an innate affinity for natural environments, especially forested ones, as a trace of our evolutionary heritage in forest ecosystems. The forests in which our species and our lineage spent hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history trace their origin, ultimately, to the Carnian Pluvial episode. We are, in this deep sense, children of the rain. The rain fell 230 million years ago on a world we would not recognize. It fell on the red salt flats of what would become the American Southwest, dissolving the salt crust that had accumulated over millions of years of evaporation. It fell on the tropical shores of the Tethys Sea, flooding the coastal flats and driving the Middle Triassic fauna inland to higher ground. It fell on what would become the Dolomites, washing sediment from nascent mountains into the warm, shallow sea below. It fell on the southern highlands of what would become Africa, filling the seasonal rivers that rhynchosaurs had gathered around for 30 million years, drowning the roots of the plants they had evolved to eat. It fell without cease, season after season, century after century, millennium after millennium, until the world had been remade so thoroughly that no trace of the old world survived in the living community. And when it finally stopped, when the volcanoes quieted and the carbon dioxide stopped accumulating and the greenhouse warming moderated and the extraordinary moisture cycle returned to something closer to normal, the world it left behind was the world we live in. The forests, the birds, the crocodilians in the tropical rivers, the turtles on the riverbanks, the mammals that would eventually become us, the dinosaurian lineage that still fills the sky 10,000 species strong. Everything that you would recognize as natural in the world around you was shaped, directly or indirectly, by 2 million years of rain. The next time it rains, really rains, a sustained, soaking, streaming rain that seems like it will never stop. Think about that. Think about a world where this has been happening for 1,000 years, for 100,000 years, for 1,000,000 years. Think about what that would do, and then understand that it did happen. That we are the consequence of it. That the rain, which seems like an interruption to our normal world, was 230 million years ago, the creator of that normal world. It rained for 2 million years. And we are all, every one of us, the children of that rain.